The Mafia boss ignored one phone call from his secretary. He'd never forgive himself. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. It only takes a second, it's completely free, and your support helps us create more heartfelt and unforgettable stories. We'd also love to know where you're watching from today, so leave your city or country in the comments below and say hello. We truly appreciate your support. Now, let's get back to our story. The most expensive mistakes are never made with bullets or money. They're made in the few seconds when you decide someone can wait. I didn't know that on the night I rejected Grace Bennett's call. If I had, I would have walked out of that room without a second thought. The conference table stretched nearly 20 feet beneath the crystal chandelier, polished walnut reflecting the city lights pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Manhattan office. 8 men sat around it, each representing an empire built on influence, wealth, and carefully negotiated trust. Every conversation carried the weight of fortunes. Every signature promised another year of uneasy peace. Outside, rain painted silver lines across the glass, turning the skyline into a blurred watercolor of steel and light. My phone vibrated once against the table. Grace Bennett. Her name appeared beside a photo I didn't even remember taking, one where she was laughing at something I had refused to admit was funny. I glanced at the screen, then at the impatient faces waiting for my decision. Later, I muttered, pressing decline without another thought. The vibration stopped. The meeting continued. Numbers replaced names. Contracts replaced conversations. I spoke with the calm confidence everyone expected from Damian Moretti, a man whose decisions could reshape companies before breakfast. They believed I never hesitated. They believed I always knew the right move. Maybe I believed it too. 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated again. Grace. I frowned. She never interrupted meetings unless something truly mattered. She managed every hour of my schedule with impossible precision. She solved problems before they reached my desk. She remembered birthdays I forgot, appointments I never wanted, and details no one else noticed. She wasn't simply my secretary. She was the quiet rhythm holding together a life that looked perfectly organized from the outside. Across the table, one of the executives cleared his throat. Everyone was waiting for my answer. I silenced the phone completely and slid it face down beside my notebook. Let's continue, I said. My voice sounded steady, certain, final. Somewhere beneath that certainty, a strange feeling tugged at me, subtle enough to ignore. Grace never called twice. She respected boundaries more than anyone I had ever met. If she kept calling, there had to be a reason. I dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. She probably needed authorization for a contract. Maybe a last-minute schedule conflict. Something that could survive another 30 minutes. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, low and distant, while rain tapped softly against the windows like patient fingers refusing to leave. Time moved strangely after that. Every discussion felt longer than it should have. Every document demanded another signature. My attention drifted toward the silent phone more often than I cared to admit. I almost picked it up once. Almost. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and forced myself to focus on business. The room applauded as the final agreement was reached. Millions of dollars had just changed direction because of a single conversation. They congratulated me. They shook my hand. They called it another perfect victory. None of them noticed that, for reasons I couldn't explain, victory suddenly felt unusually quiet. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor with their familiar whisper, and the hallway felt strangely empty, without Grace waiting beside the reception desk, holding her tablet and a fresh cup of black coffee that somehow always appeared exactly when I wanted it. The lights were still on in her office. Her favorite navy blue blazer rested neatly over the back of her chair, and a half-finished notebook lay open beside a cooling mug of tea. She hated wasting tea. That was the first detail that unsettled me. Grace Bennett finished everything she started. I reached for my phone and switched the sound back on. The screen exploded with notifications before I even unlocked it. 12 missed calls. Every single one from Grace. My chest tightened. Below them sat one voicemail and a single text message sent just 14 minutes earlier. Please answer. It cannot wait. I called immediately. The line rang once, then twice, before transferring to voicemail. Her calm recorded greeting filled the silence. "Hello, this is Grace Bennett. I cannot answer right now, but please leave a message." I hung up without speaking and dialed again. The same result. That uneasy feeling I had ignored during the meeting settled heavily in my stomach. Grace never left her phone unanswered. Never. She believed being available was part of respecting the people who trusted her. I walked into her office, studying everything more carefully. Her laptop remained open, but the screen had locked itself. A printed schedule for tomorrow sat perfectly aligned with a stack of folders, each marked with colored tabs in her careful handwriting. She had even left a handwritten reminder for me to call my younger sister on her birthday the following afternoon. I smiled for half a second before the smile disappeared. If Grace expected to return, she would have taken her notebook. She carried it everywhere. My head of security, Ethan Brooks, stepped into the doorway after receiving my call. His expression changed the moment he saw my face. "Is something wrong?" he asked quietly. "Grace is missing," I replied. Saying the words aloud made them feel impossible. Ethan immediately contacted the security team while I opened the voicemail. Static crackled for a moment before Grace spoke, her voice softer than usual, breathing slightly faster as though she had been walking quickly. "Damien, I know you are in the meeting. I am sorry for calling so many times, but I really need you to answer. I found something that does not make sense. I think." Her voice stopped abruptly. A faint sound echoed in the background, followed by silence before the recording disconnected. That was all. 21 seconds. 21 seconds that suddenly felt heavier than every contract I had signed that evening. Ethan returned a few minutes later, holding his phone. "Her apartment manager says she never came home. Her car left the parking garage around 7 o'clock, but nobody knows where she went after that." Rain continued falling beyond the windows, washing the city in reflections that looked almost unreal. I stared at the voicemail timeline, pressing play again and again, searching for something I had missed. Every replay ended with the same unfinished sentence. Every replay reminded me that while I had been celebrating another successful negotiation, the one person who never asked me for anything had been asking only for my attention. For the first time in years, I realized there were problems money could not solve quickly and decisions power could not reverse. Sleep never came that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the unfinished sentence trapped inside Grace's voicemail. "I think." Two simple words followed by silence. My mind completed that sentence 100 different ways, and every possibility ended with the same question. Why had she been trying so desperately to reach me? By 2 o'clock in the morning, the security team had mapped the last known route of her car through Midtown. Traffic cameras showed her leaving the underground garage beneath our headquarters exactly 12 minutes after I entered the meeting. She stopped once at a neighborhood coffee shop she visited almost every Thursday. The cashier remembered her ordering hot tea instead of coffee because she had smiled and said she needed to stay calm before delivering something important. After that, the trail disappeared. Rain had erased too many details. Cameras along the next several blocks were either blocked by construction or temporarily offline because of the storm. Ethan stood beside the large digital map in my office, quietly updating locations as investigators checked every possibility. No one spoke unless necessary. Even the air inside the room felt heavier than usual. I walked toward the wall of windows overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of lights still glowed beneath the clouds. Millions of people continued living ordinary lives while mine had become frozen inside 21 seconds of recorded audio. My phone rested in my hand. Without thinking, I opened my messages with Grace. There were years of conversations, meeting reminders, flight confirmations, restaurant reservations for clients, friendly reminders that I needed to eat lunch instead of surviving on espresso. Every Thanksgiving, she reminded me to visit my mother before the cemetery closed. Every Christmas, she quietly arranged gifts for employees whose families were struggling, making certain nobody knew the donations came from my company. I had always assumed those thoughtful details simply happened. I never stopped to think about the person creating them. My thumb paused over a photograph she had sent 3 months earlier. It showed the sunrise from the office rooftop. Her message beneath it read, "Beautiful mornings still exist, even when we forget to look up." I remembered reading it between meetings without replying. I had planned to answer later. Later had become never. Ethan's phone rang, interrupting the silence. He listened carefully before looking toward me. "We found her vehicle," he said. My heartbeat seemed to stop. "Where?" I asked. "An underground parking structure on the east side. It was locked and untouched. Her purse is inside. Her keys are inside. Her phone is gone." I grabbed my coat before he finished speaking. 20 minutes later, I stood beside her silver sedan beneath cold fluorescent lights. Everything inside looked painfully ordinary. Her reading glasses rested on the passenger seat beside an unopened novel. A grocery receipt listed yogurt, strawberries, whole grain bread, and fresh flowers. Grace always bought fresh flowers on Thursdays because she believed every home deserved at least one beautiful thing waiting inside. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing explained why she had vanished. Then I noticed a manila folder tucked neatly beneath the front seat, almost hidden from view. Across the front, in Grace's careful handwriting, were 4 words that made every instinct inside me awaken at once. For Damien. Personally. I stared at the folder without touching it, suddenly realizing that whatever Grace had been trying to tell me had begun long before that first unanswered call. My hands remained on the folder for several long seconds before I finally opened it. Grace had always organized information with almost impossible precision, and this folder was no different. Every page was numbered. Every document was highlighted only where absolutely necessary. There were financial reports, shipping schedules, executive calendars, and handwritten notes connecting details that most people would have overlooked. Alone, none of them meant anything. Together, they formed a picture that made my pulse slow instead of race. Someone had been quietly moving money through legitimate companies connected to my organization. The amounts were small enough to escape routine audits, but over 2 years they had grown into millions of dollars. Grace had drawn careful lines between names, dates, and transactions until the pattern became impossible to ignore. She had not been preparing a report for accounting. She had been protecting me. Ethan studied the pages beside me without saying a word. Finally, he looked up. "She found this by herself?" I nodded slowly. She never brought me problems unless she already had evidence. The realization settled over me like cold rain. Grace had probably spent months uncovering something dangerous while continuing to smile through endless meetings, answering phones, organizing schedules, and pretending everything was normal. She had carried the weight alone because she believed my attention belonged to larger battles. She had waited until she could prove every detail before interrupting me. Then, on the one night she truly needed me to listen, I had decided 30 minutes mattered more than her voice. We returned to headquarters before sunrise. The city looked washed clean after the storm, but nothing inside me felt any lighter. I spread the documents across the conference table where only hours earlier executives had celebrated another successful agreement. Now those polished wooden surfaces reflected papers instead of champagne glasses. Victory had vanished, replaced by questions. Grace had circled one name more heavily than all the others, but she had not written any accusation beside it. Instead, she left a single sentence in the margin. "Verify before trusting anyone." That was exactly how she thought. Careful, fair, never willing to destroy someone's reputation without certainty. I leaned back and closed my eyes, remembering countless moments I had dismissed without thought. Every morning, she reminded me to slow down before entering difficult negotiations. Every evening, she quietly left a bottle of water on my desk because she knew I forgot to drink during long meetings. When my father passed away 3 years earlier, she canceled every appointment for 2 days without asking permission and simply told the world I was unavailable. She had protected pieces of my humanity that I no longer noticed myself. My phone rested beside the folder. Out of habit, I almost sent her a message asking her to come into my office first thing in the morning. My thumb hovered above her name before reality returned. There would be no reply. Ethan interrupted my thoughts with another update. We checked every hospital in the city, every airport, every hotel reservation under her name. Nothing. His voice remained steady, but I could hear concern beneath it. I looked once more at the final page inside the folder. At the very bottom, beneath every document reference, Grace had written one final reminder in small blue ink. "If anything happens to me before we speak, please do not ignore this." I stared at those words until they blurred, realizing that the last instruction she had ever left for me had arrived only because I failed to answer when she still had the chance to say it herself. The next 3 days disappeared into a routine that no longer resembled my life. Meetings were canceled. Invitations went unanswered. The conference room that had once been filled with executives now held only maps, timelines, surveillance photographs, and Grace's neatly organized notes. Every morning I arrived before sunrise. Every night I left long after the cleaning crews had finished their work. Yet the office never felt empty because traces of Grace remained everywhere. The small succulent she kept alive beside the reception desk still leaned toward the window. Her favorite blue coffee mug sat beside the office machine exactly where she had left it. Even the calendar notifications continued appearing on my phone because she had programmed my schedule weeks in advance. At 9 o'clock every morning a reminder appeared that simply read, "Drink water before your second coffee." I had laughed at it before. Now I obeyed it without thinking because ignoring anything she left behind felt unbearable. Ethan watched me more carefully than he admitted. One afternoon, he quietly placed a sandwich on my desk. "You have not eaten since yesterday morning," he said. I looked at the food without touching it. "Grace usually reminded me." I answered. Ethan nodded once and walked away without another word. He understood. Everyone did. The building itself seemed quieter. Employees lowered their voices when they passed Grace's office. Some left flowers outside her door. Others placed handwritten notes beneath the vase, thanking her for remembering birthdays, helping with family emergencies, or simply making impossible days feel manageable. I picked up one card written by a young accountant. "Thank you for believing in me when I almost quit." I never knew about that conversation. Grace had changed lives so quietly that nobody realized how many people depended on her until she was gone. Late that evening, I unlocked her office for what must have been the 20th time. The room still carried the faint scent of lavender from the candle warmer she used every Friday after everyone else left. I sat in her chair for the first time. The desk drawer opened easily, revealing perfectly arranged pens, notebooks, paper clips, and folders. Everything had its place. Beneath them rested a small leather journal. I hesitated before opening it, uncertain whether I had the right. The first pages contained ordinary reminders and appointment notes, but farther inside, I found something unexpected. Grace had written short observations after difficult days, not complaints. Reflections. One entry caught my attention immediately. Damien pretends carrying everything alone makes him stronger. One day I hope he learns that trusting people is not weakness. Another page read, "He always apologizes with actions instead of words." I do not think he realizes that people notice both. I closed the journal and stared through the office window. She had understood me better than I understood myself. Somewhere along the way, I had begun measuring success by contracts, investments, and influence, while Grace quietly measured it by kindness, loyalty, and the people we helped without expecting recognition. My phone buzzed softly. Another security update. No confirmed sightings. No credible leads. The words looked colder every time I read them. I leaned back and pressed play on her voicemail once again. This time I noticed something different beneath her voice. A church bell chimed twice in the background before the recording ended. It was faint, almost hidden beneath the rain, but Grace always said details mattered because truth usually whispered instead of shouted. For the first time since she disappeared, I felt something other than regret. I felt direction. Somewhere in this city, hidden inside an ordinary sound I had ignored until now, Grace had left me one more chance to find the answer she had been trying so desperately to place in my hands. The church bell rang twice every hour between 6 in the morning and 10 at night. New York had dozens of churches, but only a handful still followed that exact pattern. Ethan and I spent the next several hours comparing the sound from Grace's voicemail with recordings gathered from locations across Manhattan. It felt impossible at first, chasing an echo hidden beneath rain and static, but Grace had built her entire investigation on details everyone else ignored. If I wanted to find her, I had to learn to think the way she did. Shortly after noon, one recording stopped me cold. St. Andrew's Church on the Lower East Side. The bell carried the same slightly uneven second chime, almost as though the bronze had developed a tiny crack after decades of ringing. I played both recordings again. Then again. Ethan looked toward me and slowly nodded. I think she was there. We drove across the city without speaking much. The neighborhood surrounding the church felt quiet compared to Midtown. Small bookstores, family-owned cafes, and brick apartment buildings lined the streets. It was the kind of place Grace loved because, as she once told me, Real stories lived where people still recognized their neighbors. Inside the church, sunlight poured through stained glass windows, painting soft colors across the wooden pews. An elderly groundskeeper greeted us with a gentle smile. When I showed him Grace's photograph, his expression immediately changed. "Yes," he said. "She came here 3 evenings ago. She looked worried, but she was very polite." My heartbeat quickened. Was she alone? He thought carefully before answering. "She met with an older gentleman for about 15 minutes. They spoke quietly near the garden behind the chapel. Before she left, she asked if I could keep an envelope safe in case someone named Damien ever came looking for her." The world seemed to stop moving. He disappeared into a small office and returned carrying a plain white envelope with my name written across the front in Grace's familiar handwriting. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter folded with perfect care. "Damien, if you are reading this, then I probably ran out of time to explain everything myself. Please do not blame yourself before you know the truth. You always carry responsibility that does not belong to you." I smiled sadly because even now she was trying to protect me. The letter continued. "Someone inside the organization has been quietly manipulating financial records to create conflict between families. I finally confirmed enough evidence to expose it, but I realized I was being watched. I called because I wanted you to leave the meeting immediately. Not because you were in danger inside that room, but because the person responsible expected you to stay there. I needed you somewhere else before the next step of their plan could begin." My hands tightened around the paper. Every sentence answered one question while creating another. Grace had not been asking for help. She had been trying to redirect me before events unfolded exactly as someone else intended. At the bottom of the page, she had written one final instruction. "Do not trust appearances. The person helping you search may already know more than they admit." I slowly lowered the letter and looked toward Ethan. He was standing only a few feet away, studying the stained glass, without realizing the last sentence had just changed everything I believed about the people standing closest to me. For the first time since Grace disappeared, I kept the truth to myself. I folded her letter carefully, slipped it into the inside pocket of my coat, and forced my expression to remain calm before walking back toward Ethan. Years of negotiation had taught me how to hide emotion behind steady eyes, but this felt different. I was no longer protecting an empire. I was protecting the only clue Grace had managed to leave behind. Ethan looked at me with quiet concern. "Did she say anything useful?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "Mostly personal thoughts," I answered. "She wanted me to keep looking." The words were true, but they were not the whole truth. For the first time in our friendship, I watched him instead of listening to him. Grace had told me not to trust appearances. That meant I needed evidence before I questioned anyone, including the man who had stood beside me through countless difficult years. We left the church separately. I told Ethan I needed an hour alone, something he accepted without argument. Instead of returning to headquarters, I drove to Grace's apartment. The building manager recognized me immediately and quietly handed me the spare key Grace had authorized for emergencies months earlier. "She always prepared for everything," he said with a sad smile. "She told me that planning ahead was another way of caring about people." Her apartment was exactly as I imagined it would be. Small, warm. Books filled nearly every shelf. Fresh herbs grew beside the kitchen window. A half-finished jigsaw puzzle rested on the dining table with only a dozen pieces missing. It struck me that Grace had built a life centered on patience while I had spent years racing from one deadline to another. I opened her desk drawer expecting financial notes or calendars. Instead, I found dozens of thank you cards from employees, neighbors, and complete strangers. She had kept every one. Tucked beneath them was a simple photograph taken during our company's annual volunteer day at a children's library. I barely remembered attending. Grace stood in the background helping a little girl choose a book while I shook hands with donors in the foreground. On the back of the photograph she had written, "Sometimes the most important work happens outside the camera's view." My throat tightened. She had never wanted recognition. She only wanted people to feel safe. While searching the bookshelf, I noticed one novel sitting slightly farther forward than the others. Inside was a folded city transit map. Several subway stations had been circled in blue ink, creating a path that ended near an old warehouse district along the East River. At first, the pattern made no sense. Then I remembered another habit of Grace's. Whenever she solved difficult puzzles, She always worked backward from the destination instead of forward from the beginning. I spread the map across her table and followed the route in reverse. It no longer resembled random subway stops. It connected every financial office where suspicious transfers had occurred before ending at an abandoned record storage building owned by one of our oldest holding companies. Grace had not hidden directions. She had hidden a conclusion. My phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. For a brief moment, I stared at it exactly as I had stared at Grace's calls days earlier. This time I answered before the first ring could finish. Ethan's voice sounded unusually tense. "Damien, someone broke into Grace's office less than 10 minutes ago. They searched everything, but they only opened one drawer." I closed my eyes. The drawer containing her journal was now empty because I had taken it with me. Whoever entered the office had arrived too late. Grace had stayed one step ahead of them. Now, if I trusted her completely, it was my turn to do the same. The abandoned records building overlooked the East River like a forgotten piece of another century. Its brick walls were weathered, its windows clouded with dust, and the faded company logo above the entrance reminded me that the property had belonged to one of my oldest businesses long before I inherited it. According to every official record, nobody had worked there in years. Grace had circled it for a reason. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the remaining distance alone. If she had risked everything to leave this trail behind, I refused to bring unnecessary attention to it. The afternoon sky hung low with gray clouds, and a cool breeze carried the scent of rain across the nearly empty streets. Inside, the building felt frozen in time. Metal filing cabinets lined endless aisles. Shelves overflowed with dusty boxes labeled with dates stretching back decades. Sunlight slipped through cracked windows in thin golden lines, illuminating tiny particles floating through the still air. Grace would have loved this place. She always believed forgotten files told the most honest stories because nobody expected anyone to read them again. I followed the numbering system she had highlighted inside the financial documents. Section C, row 12, cabinet 7. Every step matched another note she had left inside the folder. When I opened the final drawer, there were no accounting records waiting inside. Instead, I found a small locked cash box and a folded envelope taped beneath the shelf where nobody would casually notice it. The key rested inside my coat pocket. Grace had hidden it in the apartment beneath the transit map, wrapped carefully inside a tiny envelope marked, "Only when you are certain." My hands shook as I unlocked the box. Inside rested a portable hard drive, several signed affidavits, and dozens of photocopied bank authorizations connecting shell companies to names I had trusted for years. Grace had not collected suspicions. She had collected proof. At the bottom lay another handwritten note. "Damien, if you found this, then you finally slowed down enough to follow the details instead of the headlines." I smiled despite everything. That sentence sounded exactly like her. She continued, "The hardest lesson I ever learned is that good people can overlook the truth when they become too busy. You were never cruel. You were simply moving too fast to notice what was quietly happening beside you. Please do not carry guilt forever. Use it to become someone better instead." I lowered the letter, unable to speak even though nobody else stood inside the room. Suddenly dozens of forgotten memories rushed back. Grace quietly replacing exhausted employees so they could attend family events. Grace staying late to organize scholarship donations after everyone else had gone home. Grace convincing me to visit an injured warehouse worker instead of sending flowers because she believed showing up mattered more than sending gifts. Every meaningful decision people praised me for had begun with her gentle voice guiding me toward the better choice. My phone vibrated softly. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. This time I answered immediately. For a second, only quiet breathing filled the line. Then came the voice I had replayed in my mind every night since she disappeared. Weak but unmistakable. "Damien," Grace whispered. "I knew you would find the box. I just hoped you would answer this call." My eyes closed as relief washed through me so suddenly that my knees nearly gave way. For the first time in days, silence no longer felt empty. It sounded like hope finding its way back home. Grace gave me an address before the call ended, speaking slowly between careful breaths as though every word mattered. It was not a hospital or a police station. It was a quiet rehabilitation center nearly 2 hours north of Manhattan, hidden among rolling hills where people came to recover without attracting attention. Ethan drove while I stared out the window, my phone resting tightly in my hand. Every few minutes I looked at the screen simply because it still displayed the last call from Grace. Days earlier, I had ignored her name when it appeared. Now I found myself hoping it would light up again. The afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds as we reached the long driveway leading to the small brick building. White fences surrounded gardens filled with late summer flowers. Wind chimes swayed gently beneath the porch roof. It looked peaceful in the way Grace always said real healing should feel. A nurse greeted us quietly before leading me through a bright hallway filled with sunlight instead of shadows. She stopped outside a private room and smiled. "She has been asking if you would come," she said softly. My hand rested on the door for several seconds before I stepped inside. Grace sat beside the window wrapped in a light blue sweater, a book resting unopened across her lap. She looked tired but peaceful. When our eyes met, she smiled exactly the way she always had every Monday morning when handing me the first schedule of the week. Simple, warm, uncomplicated. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Words suddenly felt too small for everything that had happened between one unanswered call and this quiet afternoon. Finally, I crossed the room and sat beside her. "I am sorry," I whispered. "I should have answered." Grace shook her head gently. "You answered now," she replied. "That is what matters." Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. I had negotiated billion-dollar agreements without showing emotion. Yet one sentence from the woman who had quietly organized my life accomplished what nothing else ever had. We spent hours talking about everything we had never made time to discuss. She explained how trusted investigators had helped protect her while the evidence was secured. She admitted she had always worried that I cared more about winning than living. I admitted she had been right. Before leaving, I handed her the keys to my office. "I do not need a secretary anymore," I said with a small smile. She looked confused until I continued. "I need a partner who reminds me to become the man I keep forgetting to be." She laughed softly, the same genuine laugh I had ignored on my phone screen weeks earlier. Months passed. The evidence Grace uncovered transformed the company from the inside out. Policies changed. Leadership changed. I changed most of all. Meetings no longer began until I asked whether everyone had eaten. Birthdays appeared on my own calendar because I finally learned to remember them myself. Every Friday afternoon, Grace and I volunteered at the children's library she had always loved instead of attending another unnecessary networking event. Sometimes success looked exactly like it always had from the outside. Towering buildings, expensive suits, busy calendars. But I finally understood that none of those things measured a meaningful life. The real measure was whether the people who cared enough to call you believed you would answer. Even now, whenever my phone lights up with Grace Bennett's name, I never let it ring twice. Because power taught me how to build an empire, but one unanswered call taught me how to become worthy of the people who quietly believed in me all along.